Hello and welcome back to another edition of Project Stargate. I'm your host, Mark Brenner. Today we have The Messengers with Mike Clelland. Mike Clelland is an author, and he wrote a book called The Messengers in 2015 about his experiences with owls, UFOs, and synchronicities. Mike Clelland has a website, www.mikeclelland.com, where you can look at some of his work. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Mike Clelland to Project Stargate. Mike, thank you so much for being with us today, and welcome to Project Stargate.
Thank you. It's my honor.
Mike, I followed some of your work for a while now, and I'm interested in sharing your experiences with our audience because I think you have a very compelling story to tell. But before we kind of get into that, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your background and why you got into this field of research?
Well, I got into this field of research. It feels like I was kind of dragged into it. It doesn't feel like I chose to go into it. It feels like it chose me in a lot of ways. I'm 59 years old, and in my 30s and 40s and actually early 50s, I was living in a beautiful little town right next to Grand Teton National Park, right near Yellowstone National Park in Idaho. If you look at where Grand Teton National Park is on the map, it's right along the Idaho-Wyoming border. So I spent about 25 years there in that part of the country, mostly on the Idaho side. And I was about 3 miles from the Wyoming border where my house was. And that allowed for a lot of time in the outdoors, a lot of camping, a lot of skiing in the winter, cross-country skiing mostly, in beautiful terrain. So I really gave myself over to being in the outdoors. And before that, I had been like a yuppie in New York City. I was like right in Manhattan working for ad agencies and stuff. So I was doing illustrations in my 20s, working in New York City. And then I moved out west and I began doing book illustrations. And I started working on my own books. I thought that was almost the easiest thing. So I started writing and illustrating, often with a co-author, but a few on my own. And I did a series of instructional books that were all about camping in the mountains and spending time outdoors. So as far as a foundation, as far as who I am, that sort of need to be outside and need to adventure outside has really been kind of interwoven into who I am. So, and then your other question was, how did I get into the research and such? So I had been, I worked a lot in Alaska, and each summer I would go up to Alaska. I did that for about 10 years and worked up in the mountains there. And I came back to the valley where I was living in, the little town I was living in, and there's a branch of the school there where I was working. I kind of don't want to give the name of the school. You can look it up pretty easy. And,
sure.
And part of the reason is because my story, I don't need to embarrass the school. It would be easy to hear a little bit of my story, and then you could very quickly make a judgment call on my experiences. I feel like to understand my story, you really have to invest a little bit of time because it's complex.
Sure.
So,
sure.
Yeah. And then so there was a young woman at the school, and we got to talking, and she was working there in town, so doing, meeting the students, and this was an outdoor school where we would take them camping oftentimes for 30 days. And, but I'd been up in Alaska working at a different branch up there, and I came back to my hometown, and I stopped by the school where a lot of my friends were, and I met this young woman, and I got to talking with her, and I said, "Oh, you've been here all summer. It's October now. You've been here all summer. You must have been in the mountains tons. You must have been camping a lot. You must have camped so much this summer." And she looked at me and said, "I didn't camp once. I never did. I was just too busy. I never did it once." And I'm like, "Oh, that's terrible. I'll take you out for one night." And this was sort of a first date, which makes sound a little strange to some people, but given the culture of that little town, very much a camping culture, it's kind of normal. So we packed very light. It was a beautiful night. We expected a beautiful night, and you could predict the weather in that part of the West just by looking out to the sky in the West and what the sun is doing as it's setting. And so I was fully confident we would have a clear night. So we didn't bother bringing a tent. All we did was brought sleeping bags, and we hiked into the mountains, and the plan was just for one night. So with the very, very light packs, we hardly brought anything, just a little bit of food, and there was plenty of water on the trail. So we got within just a few hours, we got deep into the mountains. And I remember sitting on a big flat rock in this field of wildflowers. And I was sitting with Kristen, that's her name, Kristen, and the sun was setting, and I was making dinner, and I was totally in my element. I'd been outside all summer long, so I just felt completely confident and, cooking and making dinner. And I could see she was like kind of thunderstruck by the beauty of where we were. And we were talking, and there came a point in the conversation where she said something. She said something that really took me by surprise. I was sort of in awe. She was much smarter and more sensitive and more spiritual than I had guessed, or than I had assumed. So, and right as she brought up these feelings and her thoughts, an owl flew over us. And then moments later, a second owl flew over us. And then a third owl flew over us. And for about the next 2 hours, these owls flew around us. They landed on branches near us. They swooped down right over our heads. And it was really powerful. Like, it was really remarkable. And so little by little, the sun set, and we cleaned up our food. And then what we did is we just walked a bit of ways from where we had cooked because of bear issues. And 15 minutes or 10 minutes. And then we found a beautiful spot to set our sleeping bags down. The owls followed us. And so when we set our sleeping bags down on the ground and looked up at the stars, Rocky Mountain, high elevation stars, really powerful. So we were looking up at this amazing, just trillions of stars and oceans of stars above us. The nighttime sky, the stars would be blotted out just for 1 second, just for half a second. And what was happening was the owls were swooping above our faces, like close to our faces. Now, owls are totally silent in flight, so there was nothing to hear.
Like inches from your face, or like a foot from your face? Like,
It's really hard to know. I would say around a foot, maybe 2 feet.
Wow.
So there's nothing to see, right? So you're looking at the stars. All of a sudden, click, click, bloop, bloop, but they just black out for a second. Like, wow, that was just an owl. It happened to her too. So, the next morning we were like, wow, that was pretty cool. So we walked out and we got back to the car. Now here's a little odd thing. So I'm going to add this to your story because you asked me to tell this story just before we started recording. This is an odd detail. When we were walking out, I met an old girlfriend of mine from the town I was living in. And I'm going to call her Carol. That's not her real name.
Sure. Absolutely.
And so it was about the last mile. Now, Carol, we had dated about 5 years earlier. So this event with the owls happened in 2006. So on that day in 2006, we bumped into Carol, and she had 2 of her little kids with her. She's now married and had kids. And that was, and so we walked out with her. Now, her daughter must have been about 5. And Kristen walked in front of us with her daughter, and she held hands with her daughter. And I walked behind them with Kara, and Kara's little boy must have been about 3 or 4, and I picked him up and I just carried him. So it was about the last mile. We saw a great big moose, which was really wonderful. So we had a nice sighting. But what happened was I had the conversation I had been waiting to have with Kara. Like, we had broken up, and wasn't a hard breakup, but it was a sad breakup when we broke up. And we always saw each other in town. We would always say hello, but we never really talked. And so we talked on this trail, and we had the conversation that I'd been waiting to have and wanting to have. And the gist of the conversation was, my life is going very well. She said her life is going really well. And we talked a little bit about our time together and how it was really rewarding and powerful for both of us, the 1 year we spent dating. And then we both said, my life is going really well. So it's nice to hear your life. So it was just a nice conversation that we needed to have. And then we got to the car, and we said goodbye to our friend. And then I drove Kristen back into town. And as soon as the door slammed, she looked at me. She said, "That was the most important conversation I have ever had in my life with that little girl." And I was like, wow, like
Goodness.
that's not the kind of thing you hear a lot. So, and I kind of pressed her on, like, what do you mean? She said, "Oh, wow, it'd be really hard to say." But basically, she felt that little girl was so much like her as a little girl that it was like talking to herself as a little girl. This is like in the context of this night out, this one night out. So I dropped her off and I said, "Hey, listen, I love going camping for one night. If I do it again, I'm going to give you a call." And she said, "Great." So 4 days later, I said, "Let's do it one more time." So we went out again 4 days later, went to a totally different part of the mountains. And this time it was colder. Like we brought a shelter. We brought a little tent with us this time. So it was colder and it snowed on us that night actually, which was kind of funny. It didn't snow much, maybe just a dusting. But but that night it was cold and I said, "Hey, before we climb into the tent, let's take a few minutes, walk to the top of that hill, and then we can watch the sunset from up there. We can warm up. The act of walking uphill will warm us up. Then we can come back down and get into the tent, and we won't be as chilled as we are right now." We had cooked outside and stuff like that, so just a little bit chilly. So she said, "Great." So we walked up this hill, and we got to the top of the hill. We watched the sunset, and as the sun was setting, an owl flew near us and landed on a branch. Then another owl swooped above our heads, and then this third owl landed at our feet. And before, 4 days earlier, these owls had swooped around and they had kind of kept their distance, right? They kind of swooped a little close, but they would land on a tree branch way out there. Not this time. They were on branches. It felt close enough to touch. And at one point, this owl landed on the ground, literally like at our feet. And the look on Kristen's face was just like astonishment. We were both like wide-eyed with this like amazement.
I can imagine.
So that lasted a little shorter. It seemed like the owls just made their appearance and flew off. I'm convinced they're the same 3 owls. We were in a totally different part of the mountains, but I'm convinced it was the same 3 owls. I have no way to prove that, obviously, but that is certainly my gut sense. So when I saw those owls in the mountains, something happened that I did not talk about at the time. It just was too crazy, but I'm talking about it now. I heard a voice in my head when I saw those owls landing at our feet on branches near us, flying above us. I had a voice in my head that said, "This has something to do with the UFOs." Now, the context of that is during my childhood and during my young adult years, I had some events that certainly implied UFO contact. I had missing time. I had a close-up, what felt like a close-up UFO sighting. It seemed like it was just above the neighborhood. It wasn't something way off in the sky. I had a very eerie experience with what felt like a bright orange light just lighting up the nighttime sky, like click. The nighttime sky turned orange, click. The nighttime sky clicked off. And I also had an experience when I was 30 where I woke up in the middle of the night. I was living in Maine at that point. I sat up on my elbow and looked out the window, and there were 5 gray beings, 5 skinny alien beings with the big black eyes and the bald heads walking towards the house, and they were backlit by a bright light. This was in the winter. And I heard a voice in my head say, "Now is the time to put your head on the pillow and shut down." And that's exactly what I did. I just went right to sleep.
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Oh, absolutely. Sure.
Stopping for just a second. This is kind of similar to an experience I had in my youth as well. Kind of very similar. What else was going through your mind when you had these non-human entities putting these ideas and thoughts into your mind? Did you feel confusion, excitement, fear? What would you best describe your feelings?
So the feeling was absolutely nothing. It felt like I was emotionally blank. It felt like I was emotionally empty. in a weird way. And now I've also, this is going to be a little tough to explain. There was a strange feeling, a strange mood. It would be appropriate to call it dream-like, but I don't think it was a dream. Like the room exactly matched my room. The bedroom felt exactly like my bedroom, right? So it didn't, like when I dream, it's somewhat distorted. It always is, right? The room is missized or something seems askew.
Right.
There's like dream logic to it, but not in this case. It felt exactly like I was in my bedroom. Now, there was also this sense of like a hyper clarity, right? Like everything was in perfect focus. There was a eerie silence. There was this clarity and this kind of, I don't know what to call it, like sort of head in the fishbowl kind of feeling. Like it was a little bit too clear. It was a little bit too vivid. It was a little bit too real, like more real than real, if that makes sense.
Right.
And I have, now here's the little thing. So that feeling I've had a few more times and it kind of freaked me out a little bit. It was so strange. And so here, so that next morning after I fell asleep, I never bothered to even go outside to see if there were footprints in the snow. I just dismissed it as a dream and I was in complete denial and I wasn't going to go there. And I was just like, no way, nah, I'm not going to deal with this. So, but I talked to a woman one time and I asked her, what was your sense when she had a close-up UFO sighting in Los Angeles? And she said, when I was in the presence of that craft, when you take two magnets, you have two strong magnets and they click tight together, right?
Right.
And then you can pull them apart and then you can twist them 90 degrees and then try to press them together. But now their little poles or whatever you would call it are opposite. So you try to push them together, but they won't go together. Like you can't get them together. They'll sort of undulate and there'll be this kind of warbling energy as you try to push them together. Does that, you know what I'm talking about?
Right. I'm following you.
Yep. So the woman said, you know what it was like being in the presence of that craft? It was like being in that space in between the two magnets in that warbling energy. And when she said that, I was like, oh my God, you know. Like I knew right away, like I had experienced exactly the same thing because that is the most accurate way I've ever heard it described. That sense of being in between the two magnets where they won't click together in that kind of warbling energy. So, so you asked what I was feeling that night, and it was this, my emotions were blank. My emotions were empty, right? I saw this thing that should have been scary, right? But I wasn't scared at all. I was empty of any emotion. I went, it's interesting. They were backlit by a bright light. Now it'd be perfect if it was a great big giant flying saucer in the yard, but it wasn't. It looked like it was about the size of a washing machine. It's just a bright light, like essentially like a bright light pointing right in my window. So there wasn't anything for me to see. And I remember I was drawn to that bright light. And I kind of ignored the five beings that were right up close to the window. And instead I looked past them at the bright light, which I thought was odd that I would do that, right? So that the threat, I guess, would have been the five beings, like really close to the house, walking towards the house. And I was the only one home. So there was no other reason to walk towards the house other than me. That I should have jumped out of bed and grabbed a knife and bolted the doors, but I didn't. I just went to sleep. So.
That's and the funny thing about that is that I run across this so much. You'll see, and it's happened to me before, where you see some kind of something that doesn't seem to be in our normal reality or outside the barriers of it, and you're just like, oh, whatever. But then later on down the road, you look back retrospectively and be like, man, what the heck just happened at that time, And it doesn't really dawn on you, hey, this is something really weird happening until you're like years older. At least that's how it's been for me.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and it haunted me. It really haunted me for years. And so exactly. So those events, right? So the missing time, the close-up UFOs as a 12-year-old boy, the orange flash in the sky, the five beings out my window. Those, like, I have very clear memories of all of those. And oh wow, man, I was not going to deal with that. I was pushing that stuff away. I was bearing it, and not me. It did not, like, no way. Like, I'm not gonna come to any conclusion. I was going to do exactly the opposite. I was going to fight. I was going to push away any conclusion. So and that was getting harder and harder to do, because what I started doing was reading UFO books, and I was very, very aware of, like, how much my story sounded like the people who had UFO contacts in the books I was reading. So I was somewhat obsessively reading UFO books at that point, and that's, I was kind of that where I was when I was in the mountains with Kristen. I knew, like, there's going to be a time when I'm going to have to look into this. So I was in the mountains with Kristen. I saw a real set of owls. These were real owls. They were like, 8, 11 inches tall, 10, 11 inches tall. They were flying around. They were doing what owls would do. They were landing at our feet. We had perfectly clear view of them. They weren't off in the distance. Somehow they weren't, they were right there, right with us. And then I had this message. I titled the book The Messengers. I had a message. It might have been my voice. It might have been sort of an outside voice, but the message was, this has something to do with the UFOs. So I didn't tell Kristen that. I didn't tell anyone that.
Sure.
But after that event, wow, I went crazy. Like, I went, I'm not exaggerating. Like, I lost my mind. I was like, what is the meaning of the
absolutely.
Of the
this is something that's completely out of our paradigm, or what we call paradigm, I guess you could say. Like I said, it's just like, when this stuff happens, what do you say about it? Who do you tell? And I've gotten out to where I'm pretty open about it, but as far as myself goes, but a lot of people at I work for one of our biggest retailers, the world's biggest retailers, and in a distribution center, and everybody knows me. That's so funny. Everybody knows who I am, and I don't know who some of these people are, but they say hi to me. And sometimes people will stop me and say, "Hey, Mark, tell me some of these stories." And I'm just like, should I tell them about this? I'll tell them about that.
Oh, I know. Oh, gosh, I know. Yeah. So, yeah, exactly. And, yeah. And it's funny, because what happens is, like, I'll tell these stories in a public environment. Like, they'll be like at a dinner table or something like that, where they're at a party or something like that, where there's a handful of people there, and I'll tell a couple of stories. And you can see some people just, like, squirming in their shoes, like, they don't want to hear it, and then, I kind of, I kind of know if it's one-on-one, when to share something and when not to share something. But, but what happens is, this is pretty consistent. Like, I'll share a story, and then, like, you share it to 5 people, 4 people will be uncomfortable, and one person will come up to me afterwards and say, like, I had a very similar experience, or my wife had an experience like that, or my mom had an experience and it terrified her, or she never could talk about it. So they'll say, thank you for talking about that, because I can't.
I think you're brave, Mike. I think you're a great guy, and brave for coming out and telling this story. I really do.
It feels like I couldn't not tell it, and honestly, like I'm not the president of the bank or anything like that. I drew cartoons and in camping books on, like, how to, like, go to the bathroom in the woods and stuff like that, where I was in. So, like, I'm like, not, like, I got no reputation to uphold or anything like that. And so I was never worried, really. And then also, I think that the times have changed. We're in a new world now. You turn the clock back 20 years or even 10 years, I don't think it would have been as easy to come forward with my story the way I have.
Oh, definitely not. Definitely not.
Yeah, it's changed. Yeah. So, I think of what happened to someone like Whitley Strieber in the late 80s or mid 80s, when he came out with his account, and how 2 things happened. One, he had, upwards of 250,000 letters arrive at his home, people saying, I had the same experience or a very similar experience. And then at the same time, he was kind of vilified on, like, talk shows and in the press, and kind of made fun of. So he had both ends of it, right? He had the ridicule, and he had the confirmation that so many people were coming forward. Now I have a much smaller book. My book is not a big seller by any means, but I mean, Whitley Strieber's book was a phenomenal bestseller. It was in every grocery store. It was in every bookstore in the world for years. I mean, he sold millions of copies of that book. And, I've sold a few thousand of mine, but
you're talking about Communion, correct?
Communion, exactly. Yes. With
Okay,
a
cool.
gray alien on the cover. Exactly. Yes. So sorry if I guess so,
That's
but
okay.
so he had two things happening. He got vilified, he got ridiculed, and he got a lot of confirmation from the grassroots up, so he was demonized from the top down and thanked from the bottom up.
Yeah,
And
I
what
remember,
I found
I remember South Park was horrible about it. South Park is South Park. They make fun of everybody, but the subject matter, I remember listening to that episode one time or watching it one time, and I was a little appalled by it because what happened to Whitley was very invasive and it's akin to rape, and I don't think there's anything funny about it.
Yeah, I agree. But at the same time, I mean, so pop culture is what it is, and you can't put a lid on it, right? So
Exactly.
But yeah, so it was, it was in poor taste for sure. But they were trying to break rules, right? That the show South Park was trying to break rules by
And they did. They broke a lot of them.
taboo subjects and stuff. So where was I? So I'm going to jump back to the story with Kristen, right? So in the years after that event, I started looking into the days after that, I started looking into what owls meant. I reached out to UFO investigators because of the sort of message I got. This has something to do with UFOs. So I started calling up UFO researchers, and they would say, "Oh, that's very interesting. Here, why don't you talk to this person?" I would call up that person who had a direct experience, and little by little, I started networking with these people. And I would ask everyone the same question: have you ever had any odd experiences with owls? And it wasn't 100%, but I started collecting the weirdest stories. And I started collecting them and archiving them and trying to keep files. Wow, I'm like, it's difficult to keep a thorough set of files. But and then in 2009, I started a blog. And initially the blog was just going to be about synchronicities and funny coincidences, which I've had a lot of. And in the first couple of days of the blog, I posted that story that I just shared, and I had written it up as a sort of diary entry. So I didn't really need to do much. I just needed to put it online. That story, just drop it into the blog format. And after I posted it, I thought to myself, what was Kristen talking about that first night when we saw the first owls? And I couldn't remember. I remember it was something that struck me as impressive. And I called her up, and she had moved out of the valley long ago, and she was living back in Michigan, where I grew up, somewhat near where I grew up. So I called her in Michigan, and I said, Kristen, what were you talking about the first night when we saw the first owls? And she said, oh, I remember exactly what I was talking about. I was trying to articulate my deepest beliefs on what God is. And then I was like, so that one detail, right? So this trippy experience with the owls and this mystical event with, Kristen 2 times, 4 nights, 4 nights later, 3 owls, like that mystical experience got a whole lot weirder when she added that detail. Like I'm not at all a churchy person. Like I went to church as a little kid and I haven't been back in decades, but sure. I recognize the power of that, of the owls appearing at that moment. So I started the blog and I started posting my UFO accounts, sort of begrudgingly. Like I felt like I was like, there's some synchronicities involved in how I started posting those too. So I started posting my UFO stories. I started reaching out to people. I started a little podcast, and every person I talked to, I would ask, "Have you ever had any odd experiences with owls?" And I started putting little essays on the line, and so what was happening, and I put right at the top of my blog, is I want to hear your owl stories, and I started collecting them, and they started as a trickle, and that soon became a torrent, and I sort of quickly became known as the owl guy. And so if you Google UFOs, owls, anyone can do it right now. That my name is the first thing that is going to come up, and it's going to be about the next 25 things below that. And what has happened is I have collected enough stories. It's about one a day. So one a day times 10 years, roughly. I mean, you do the math. That's a lot. and sometimes sometimes it eases off a little bit, and sometimes I get 4 or 5 in a day and such, but it's around one a day. And I have been flooded, and the stories all have this remarkable kind of vibe interwoven into the stories, and I'm in awe of what I've been receiving. So the connection of UFOs and owls seems really nebulous. But what I'm finding is it's like this rich vein of gold, so the big totality of the UFO experience, like my arms are outstretched as far as I can right here in my office right now. And that's the whole UFO lore, right? That's all the UFO stuff. It's this giant. It's unending. There's books and books and books on top of books been written on it, and it just goes on and on and on. But the owl thing is the tiniest little sliver within this big mess of information. And other people have certainly written about owls. Like Whitley Strieber wrote really eloquently about owls, and so have other people. But no one went as crazy as I did.
I've heard of cows and deer
yeah,
as
deer
well.
and raccoons and big squirrels and firemen and dead relatives. Yeah. So, but
there's this one woman. I just want to cut this in real quick, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I was reading an account of a woman who was having contact and abduction experiences, and hers were some of the most bizarre I've ever heard of. I can't remember the lady's name off the top of my head, but regardless, one of the accounts I remember she specifically spoke about, Mike, was she was driving, and I believe it was if memory serves me, I think it was in broad daylight, which about 60% of these experiences I've looked at do happen in broad daylight. But regardless, she was driving and she sees a cow on the side of the road. Well, she drives by it and the cow's just standing there, and she's like, "Huh, that's weird." The next thing she knows, this cow is keeping pace with her car. And I chuckled when I heard that. But she did end up having a block of missing time. And I've heard these stories about owls is one of the most prevalent. Deer is another one that's fairly common, I've heard. But I just wanted to add that in. I apologize for interrupting.
Oh, no, that's considered the screen memory. Sure. So here's a story. So the screen memory is one aspect of the story. Oftentimes people will say they saw like a 4-foot tall owl in the middle of the road, and they pull up to the owl, and the owl has to look over the owl can look over the hood of their car. And they're like, well, Dolores Cannon. Do you know the author Dolores Cannon?
I'm not so familiar with this, but if you could enlighten us?
So yeah, Dolores Cannon died, I think, in 2015. But she had been doing for like 30 years, she had been doing hypnosis therapy as a practitioner, mostly just like quitting smoking and weight loss and stress relief and getting to sleep at night, kind of hypnosis, family therapy with hypnosis, and then she started doing the UFO stuff. Now, she started looking into the UFO research, and she published a big stack of books, which are very popular. And, her conclusions are pretty spiritual. They're pretty far out. And I know a lot of nuts and bolts researchers kind of, dismiss her or won't go there. But wow, her stuff is pretty remarkable. So she taught this hypnosis technique to people. So since her passing, there are a lot of people out there right now who use the same hypnosis technique that she did, and to access the deepest parts of the subconscious where these memories, or these, let's almost say collective memories, are hidden. because she was doing more work with like the collective psyche of man in a way, and how these things are part of our overall folklore and history and mythology of like what it means to be a human, this kind of paranormal stuff. But so she was so she was at a point in her life. She had just had a meeting with a bunch of her peers, other therapists who were doing hypnotherapy, and she kind of said, like, I've got this stuff, this UFO stuff. It kind of seems to be like wanting to emerge. People, I'm using hypnosis, and sometimes these people are telling me these UFO stories while under hypnosis, and I don't know what to do. Like, either I can follow this, or I can just, ignore it and move on. And she said, I have to come to a decision. Either I'm going to follow it or I'm not going to follow it. So that was the night she had this meeting with her peers, and she had the discussion, like, what do I do? Yes or no? Do I follow this UFO stuff in my hypnosis therapy? So she's driving home that night. There's a great big owl in the road. And she pulls right up to it, and it's big enough. She's driving a big truck, and she lived in Arkansas, and the owl is looking right above the hood of her truck. But owls can't be that big. So she kind of like, get out of the way, and it flies off, and it flies further down the road, and it stands again. She pulls up to it, and it flies off, and it flies further down the road. It takes her all the way to her driveway, stands at the edge of her driveway, and lets her go home. And she told her son, like, oh, I saw this big owl. It was looking over the hood of my truck, and her son was an adult, and he said, Mom, like, owls can't be that big. And later she saw a display at a museum, a natural history museum. And she saw, like, it was all the owls in the world were all lined up behind glass. And she looked and looked and looked, and none of the owls matched what she saw. They were all way too small. And she said, something else happened that night. So the question I ask in my research, what was going on before your sighting? And now I don't differentiate at all between an owl sighting and a UFO sighting. To me, they're like the same thing, right? I mean,
understandably too.
Yeah, like I just weight them the same. I don't give one more energy than the other. I try to keep them equally weighted. So the question I ask is, what was going on in your life before your sighting, and what changed after? So she wrote about it in her book. She was very clear. That night, just before she saw the owl, she realized she had to decide whether she was going to go down the road and deal with this UFO stuff in her research. The next morning, the aftermath is also equally clear. She followed up. She did go down that road, and she did do some very, very powerful, deep research into the strangeness of UFOs, with an owl as like a hinge point in that decision. I mean, I get that. So given my research and stuff like that, I've got, my files are overflowing with stories of that kind of power. So you were asking about the screen memory. Yes. Oh, you there? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So the screen memory. So this is a wonderful story that I use a lot there's a woman, she's an adult now, but at the time she was 19 years old, and she was teaching, I think, for the Girl Scouts. She was teaching at a girls' camp, like as a scout leader. And she was in the mountains. She was in the backcountry, and she was camping, and there was like a series of camps set up, and they were just the way the tents were and where the kids were and stuff like that. There was some tents over here, and then there was other tents over here, and there was water. So like she was going to get the water. And so she was walking between the two sites on this path, and she came around a corner. Now, this is someone who already had UFO experiences, or let's say alien contact experiences. She was very aware of these experiences in her life, and she had seen them always at night. So she had literally like gray aliens peeking around her bedroom door at night.
That's creepy.
Yeah, super creepy. I've sat with her. She's explained it. Yeah, it's pretty creepy. So she's walking down the path. She turns the corner. She's alone. She can hear the kids playing in the background. And she turns the corner, and there's a gray alien standing, full daylight, at the edge of the trail. Full daylight. The skinny gray alien with the big bald head and the big black eyes. And this alien like whoosh, looks at her, and she looks at it, and she says there's this telepathic communication that takes place when you're in the presence of these beings. And she said there was like this reverberating echo, like the alien was saying like owl, 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 and she was hearing the word owl, owl, and it was like bouncing back and forth, like its consciousness was bouncing back and forth with hers. And she watched this gray alien turn into an owl. And then the owl turned and ran into the woods.
Good
Didn't
God.
fly, it ran into the woods. So there's an event where like some sort of psychic impression was put into her mind where the gray alien turned into an owl. Now I don't think like what if they had a video camera, like a hidden video camera videotaping, what would it have seen? I really can't answer that.
That's a
Would it
good
have seen?
question. That's a very good question.
My sense, it would not have seen the being turn into an owl. I sense that was all taking place in the mind of the observer, in her mind.
I think you're right. I think that these entities, whatever they are, I think that they seem to have an ability to, I don't want to say mind control, but it's something akin to that, in a psychic or maybe even in a telepathic way, be able to put ideas. And I even seen some evidence that they're able to affect our emotions in some way, canceling emotions, pain, our sensory perception as we see it. They seem to have some influence on that.
Oh, I would go straight up and say they have mind control abilities. Yeah, like that's my sense strongly.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And yeah, so like my own experience, like waking up in the middle of the night and seeing the beings out my window. By all rights, my heart should have like jumped out of my chest. I should have gone into adrenaline freak out. I should have reacted. I didn't. I was eerily numb. Like, I mean, like, whatever, standing in line at the post office, I've got more emotion than I had that night, you know? So yeah, I would say that I was under the influence of some sort of mind control. I can't prove that, obviously, but that's my sense.
Pink Floyd, Comfortably Numb. I think that sounds like a description of how you were feeling at that point in time. Could that be accurate? I know that sounds silly, but
I was empty, like whoosh, like just felt like a vacuum cleaner, like hooked up to my emotions and just sucked them all out, and there was nothing there. Yeah.
dang, wow, that's amazing. We're truly sailing into the unknown here, Mike. I think this is a pretty good spot to take a break. But when we come back, I want to hear more about this. And it's going to be, I say in part two, it's just going to be a 100% open mic for you. I don't want this conversation to end. This is riveting. We have Mike Clelland with the Messengers here on Project Stargate. We'll be right back.